I'm Rodger Baker, Executive Director of the STRATFOR Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
This podcast was recorded on July 12th, 2024. For the latest updates and RANE analysis, please contact your relationship manager or reach out to us at info@ranenetwork.com.
Welcome to Applied Geopolitics, the podcast of the STRATFOR Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE. I'm Rodger Baker. This has been a significant year for elections around the globe, and with more to come. In geopolitical analysis, at times we argue that elections and individuals don't really matter or only have a limited impact on the grand flow of future history. But this is a matter of perspective. There are deep geopolitical trends where individuals are perhaps less significant than the broad shifts in societies, economies, and military balances. But at the contemporary and tactical levels of geopolitical analysis, individuals play a much more significant role as drivers of action. As such, it's important to move between scales and scopes of time and geography to fully understand both the near-term implications of changes in leadership and, in the long term, whether they reflect or even trigger new patterns in the international balance. Today I'm pleased to be joined once again by Matt Gertken, the Chief Geopolitical and U.S. Political Strategist at BCA Research, the world's leading independent macro investment research firm, to discuss some trends in recent elections and their broader geopolitical implications. And Matt, thanks for being here.
Hey Rodger, thank you for having me back. It's great to talk to you always.
So let's start off as we look at this and the broader, deeper geopolitical trends.
Well, I very much agree with how you started. I think as we get to the tactical level, that's where personalities and rhetoric can make a difference. But in general, I bring a geopolitical approach and a geopolitical method, which of course I learned in great part from you yourself and many others over the years that I've worked with. I bring that geopolitical approach to U.S. politics. So I think one of the distinctive sort of advantages that I bring when I look at the U.S. Domestically is that I tend to say, you know, these are two factions. There's sort of a rural and an urban faction. There's an establishment political elite. There's an anti-establishment political movement. The ruling party has an incumbent advantage, and that's separate from the sitting president advantage, although the sitting president advantage is a little bit bigger than just the incumbent party advantage. So there's a lot of ways that we can talk about this from a structural point of view, from a cyclical point of view, and looking at the power of institutions, including the political parties. And I actually think that's the right way to do it. So I would maybe start off by saying that I think the personalities are being overrated right now in the news media. First and foremost, if President Biden does end up stepping down from the race, from the 2024 election, then the likeliest candidates to supplant him are establishment Democratic politicians. So there isn't really a dramatic difference between Vice President Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, or even Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. These are all establishment Democrats, and in fact, the Democratic Party has been sort of consensus-oriented or committee-driven in recent years. So the difference is with President Trump, who is an anti-establishment politician who has sort of led the Republican Party in an anti-establishment direction, and probably would be different than his vice president. And I'll just say one more thing there. Vice presidents, whether it's Harris or Trump's future vice presidents are notable because they're first-term presidents, and they're younger. They have more flexibility on issues. They can listen to their advisors more closely and be more data-driven in the advice that they take. And they have to try to contend for a second election, which means that they need to pay a little bit of attention to the economy in pursuing their foreign policy. And what we see with both Trump and Biden is they'd be second-term presidents. They could be a little bit more reckless or aggressive in foreign policy simply because they don't have the option of getting reelected. And Trump specifically, if we want to get into personalities, he's clearly hubristic. He's more willing to ignore his advisors than Biden. But given that Biden, if he clings on now, he's clinging on in direct contradiction to what a lot of younger and expert people are telling him. Biden also is going to be seen as maybe not mentally stable. So if your concern with Trump was that he was mentally unstable, well, you're not going to get away from that concern. So bottom line here, we've got two old people at the end of a generation that are likely to run the United States. They'll be second termers, and they can be pretty risky. And if anything changes that brings a younger cohort into power in the U.S., that's quite positive from the perspective of listening to their advisors and pursuing more moderate policies.
So building on that a little bit, and then also expanding out internationally, you talk about the sort of establishment component, the anti-establishment component. The word populism is being thrown all around a lot these days, both in the U.S. election and in international elections. And we've seen new elections in the U.K. We've seen the French elections, and we're seeing these shifts, in the sort of ill-defined terms of shifts to the left or shifts to the right within these places. How do you look at that concept of populism in these traditional democracies, and what are some of the political, social, or economic implications as we think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question because the term is just so badly misused. I mean, obviously there's the partisan usages where for a long time populist sort of meant left populist. Nowadays, certainly the past 10 years, it in the media it's just used as right-wing populist. But of course there are both forms, and we also should define what it is anyway. So I take the view that what is really relevant here is establishment versus anti-establishment. The political establishment can be defined as an elite group of people, whether they emerged from the corporate elite or wealth, or whether they emerged from the political elite or office, whether they were lawyers who rose up through government and party machinery, or whether they were businessmen or people whose support comes from the business world. So that's important, but both of those can be and are part of the establishment. What the establishment has struggled with is generational change and ideological change, socioeconomic change. One major component is that the United States, in order to defeat the Soviet Union, adopted a very free market ideology. And that meant low taxes, free trade, no enforcement of border controls or security, really. Those things have all sort of come back to haunt the political elite now. People got very unhappy with income inequality and wealth inequality, and that really was revealed by the Great Recession and in the financial crisis. And so that's where we saw the huge reaction in the mid-2000s, and of course a very similar process in the UK. So inequality was the result of the free market policies, and inequality then led to political movements and solutions that were against the consensus and against an established consensus in the sense that widely held consensus across academia, the Congress, the courts. And what would that be? Well, I think it's clearly on display with the Republican Party. First and foremost, it's a turn against the unregulated immigration. So that's the primary impetus for this movement, and I think it's the most significant implication if they win in the 2024 election. The U.S. will no longer have, lawless borders, and in fact will probably crack down even on some legal immigration to some extent, and there could even be a sort of radical or reactionary move to deport people, which I think would be very divisive, but could happen if Republicans win by a large enough victory. So turning tough on immigration marginally is one thing, but a draconian turn on the border and immigration would be a structural change in the U.S. over the past several decades, and I think that's an anti-establishment move. The corporate elite liked the cheap labor. The political elite were either willing to listen to the corporates, or they maybe believed they could get if they were on the left, they believed they could get a political advantage from having a lot of immigrants and ethnic diversity in the U.S. So that's anti-establishment. The other thing is with taxes and redistribution. So the previous consensus was that it was a low tax regime. George Herbert Walker Bush lost the election famously, the 92 election, because he famously had said that he wouldn't raise taxes, and then he did that when he was in power. And ever after that, everyone was sort of afraid to raise taxes, and Democrats have been extremely reluctant, even though they openly avow redistribution. When they're in office, they don't really want to hike taxes much. And we saw that with Biden. He had a full sweep. He spent $5 trillion, but he did not end up raising the corporate rate or trying to remove the Trump tax cuts like he implied that he would. And instead, the only thing he did get done, which is notable, but the only thing on taxes was joining with a global minimum tax. So that's been a policy for a while, but what we see now is that if Democrats, if they were able to win a full sweep, which is the least likely scenario in 2024, but they would definitely move more in a direction of raising taxes. At that point, they would say, okay, the Reaganite Republican anti-tax movement has reached its full sway and lost, and therefore we now have the political capital to actually start redistributing wealth and addressing this inequality problem. So there's that, but it's the least likely outcome. Now with Republicans, notice that they have sustained this low tax view, but Trump and the populists are not necessarily all that comfortable with it. It was the establishment Republicans that led the tax cuts in 2017 under Paul Ryan, the House Speaker. And Trump didn't necessarily benefit from it. In fact, he suffered in the midterm elections. It was seen that he sort of gave a big sop to the companies rather than listening to the working class and the people. And so there's not as much of a drive for Republicans now to give tax cuts to, quote unquote, woke corporations. And I'll just conclude this by saying the other element is raising tariffs. Republicans want to raise tariffs now, and Trump has consolidated that view. But that, of course, is a tax on trade that companies will pass off to consumers. So Republicans are now in favor of redistribution. They just want to do it by taxing trade rather than taxing income. And so what we see is we've broken with the establishment on immigration and fiscal policy, huge changes there, as well as trade, where we're a protectionist on both sides of the aisle.
So as you're talking, a couple things that come up. One, what do you see as the relationship between society and politics? Does politics drive society, or does society drive the shift in politics? And maybe look beyond the United States, look at, as we think about other elections that we've been watching, whether the perceived slight hit against Modi in India, or certainly the rejection in France in the first round of voting of the existing leadership, and the big change in the British leadership. And with that, which has more staying power, the political dynamic or the underlying society and social dynamic?
Well, that's a really good one, and of course it's also something that's extensively written on in the universities. Here's how I do. I personally like to take the understanding or interpretation of politics that is classical and incorporates society, meaning that if you go back to Plato and Aristotle, when they talk about politics, they are talking about society. And that's how I like to be. Now, and that's just me. In modern times, I would say that society is the driver. I would say that it's social forces in the movement of peoples and the well-being or the lack of well-being of peoples that is driving the politics. And political systems emerge from societies, and then those political systems decay. The society changes, but the underlying people are still present. So, for example, when we look at Russia, we've seen several regimes. We've seen the Tsarist regime, and then this communist regime, and then now the sort of conservative federation. And we can have further changes in Russian regimes, but they have a lot of similarities beneath them. And the same point can be made about China, the fact that the Communist Party is treated really as another dynasty within a dynastic cycle that has pervaded across many iterations of the Chinese society. So I tend to think social forces are the driver, but I also would be very quick to point out that social forces and social organization among humans takes a political form. Political systems always exist. There's a strongman leader, or there's a council, or there's an ability to have a widespread vote. And so in that regard, we can't truly take politics out of society, but I wouldn't want to take a very strict political view that the political forms or the government type at any given time are predominating over the social forces, because I don't think that's the case. And revolutions are always the great example where you can show that revolutions will occur and they will simply change the political form. And so then I guess if I can go a little further to address some of the ones you mentioned, like India, this was an interesting example. I think it was unfair that Modi was included on all the magazine covers when they would show the bad guys, and they'd show Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, and then they just sort of throw in Narendra Modi as a strongman. But the reality was that he was operating in a social and political context that was democratic, and there was really no reason for grouping him in with autocrats, because it was evident to many people, including myself, that he was not only capable of losing a single-party majority, but actually quite likely to lose a single-party majority. And he still had to run with a party, So anyway, he had to run with a party, but then now his party has to run with other parties, run the country as a coalition, and democratic change is alive and well in India. And that's important from India's perspective, because it means reforms to the economy or defense policy or anything else. These things are taking place with a popular mandate, and they derive their legitimacy from that huge mass of people that are voting in India. And that's just so different from Putin. Now, of course, Xi Jinping is a little bit different in the sense that, even though he doesn't have elections, you can argue that he's got a much broader and more sustainable base of support. Putin, the problem is he's got popular support for now, but later it's going to wane because of the negative social and economic future that Russia faces based on their trends. China also has a lot of dark clouds on the horizon, but it's still a more sustainable economy than in Russia. And so Xi Jinping may be able to sustain some popular support, but India's advantage is that each change in the political system, is motivated by representation, and that just creates some flexibility and some resilience. So now, does this mean democracies are always superior? No. I mean, ineffective democracies are less stable than highly effective and responsive autocracies. But I would agree with those who make the point that if the political system is rigid and autocratic, then it's much more prone to collapse over time, simply because it doesn't incorporate those social forces and give them representation and a stake in the system.
Are we seeing a extent of the post-Cold War expansion of democracies and free markets and open trade and all of these things? Has it reached sort of a peak, and is it flatlining? Is it reversing? Is it just a temporary dip that we're moving into, as we're seeing and reflected in a lot of these sort of anti-establishment elections, particularly in the Western democracies? Is there an underlying deeper geopolitical dynamic that is either being driven by these elections or being reflected in these elections?
Yeah, well, in recent elections this year, and this does apply to almost all of them so far, there is an anti-incumbent effect. Now, the anti-incumbent effect in some cases actually overturns and kicks out the ruling party, but in many cases it simply reduces the dominance of the incumbent party. But it's still an anti-incumbent effect. And so what happened was, of course, COVID and then the inflation surge, and then inflation came down, but voters are responding to the surge of inflation. So they're saying, over the past few years there was a spike in inflation. We're unhappy about it. We're unhappy about the cumulative inflation over these several years. So when you point to a chart showing that the rate of change has slowed down, that doesn't really satisfy us. They go to the voting booth and they vote against the incumbents. In the UK, the Conservatives were completely discredited because of Brexit, and which was seen and then widely believed to have compounded their problems during COVID and the inflation. And so you had a total anti-incumbent change. And by the way, the results of the election can sort of be overrated, but it's definitely true that the Conservative Party had a big drop-off. With India, you saw the ruling party lose its single-party majority. With South Africa, you saw the ruling party for the first time ever lose a single-party majority. In France, Macron had already sort of had to work with others in the assembly, but he further lost ground in the assembly. So what we're seeing is primarily, I think, an anti-incumbent election trend across the world driven by inflation. It's not a good sign for the Democrats in the 2024 election, although it doesn't mean they can't win, because again, the effect could be that they simply win by a much narrower margin. The margin was already very narrow in 2020, and I think that's the real risk for them. But there is still a chance that they sort of squeak by because President Trump has some very well-known flaws. And what I mean by that is establishment Republicans, we talked earlier, establishment Republicans, the country club Republicans, or the sort of corporate elite Republicans, they are still a group that may not support Trump in enough of an extent to help him prevail in the swing states. So we don't know the outcome yet, but it is looking like it could be another anti-incumbent outcome. So I think we can draw that conclusion that voters, when their well-being and when their standard of living are deteriorating as a result of too much money printing, or or other things like supply chain interference and cause higher prices, voters react to that, and the democracy gives them the channel to do that. In other places, they'll react negatively, but if they don't have the vote, then it's up to the government to try to incorporate that reaction in their policies. And if they don't, then that could be a revolutionary environment. So there's probably a lot more to be said there, but that's sort of how I would interpret the year of elections thus far.
Well, one of the things you seem to point out is that a lot of, and this is probably not a big surprise and it's not new and unique to today, that many of these elections are driven by domestic and local dynamics. They're not driven by the international issues that are going on. They're not actually driven by climate change. They don't seem to be driven by the war in Ukraine, by the competition with China. That plays a role in them, but a lot of it is down to people vote based on what is going on in their life and what are the things directly impacting them. And that seems to suggest that, at least at the moment, given the multiple crises, as you pointed out, COVID, economic crises, inflation, all of these dynamics have countries looking inward, at least from the electorate. Does that suggest that at this moment where everyone is looking inward, where a lot of these places are having to deal with coalitions, sometimes very complex and not very collaborative coalitions, that inward focus, does it have an impact on the foreign policy and the way in which these countries look at the external factors? And how do we think about that then in the broader global geopolitical balance as we see, France, Germany, the UK, the United States, critical countries, even Japan, these major centers of internationalist interaction being drawn to look more domestically or continentalist in their outlook?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll take a stab at it. First of all, I do agree with you and have learned. I think that's maybe one of the things that I really feel that I've learned after 18 years of trying to do geopolitical analysis, is that domestic growth of movements of peoples, and this goes back to those social forces. All politics is local, and that's just reflecting the fact that these are bodies of people that they are separate from each other, even though they do interact with each other through trade and immigration and other things. We do have state systems, nation states, and that implies that the nations or the peoples have borders. And domestic developments can occur in one place and really can be the opposite or unrelated in a neighboring place. And of course, the media is always very quick to try to draw cross-border or transnational trends that are very weak when you start to look at them. Now, at the same time, I think very well, as I do, the technology has created, in communication and transportation, these things have created much greater transnational forces than existed many years ago. So so we're dealing with both things. We're dealing with the fact that social and political groupings are primarily domestically driven, but they are also more permeated by transnational trends than probably ever before. And that's globalization. And I look at that, and globalization has taken place over the course of millennia, and I don't think that process, that broad process, is reversing. There was a more particular form of it that emerged in the 1990s, which the economist Danny Roderick called hyperglobalization. And I think we've clearly seen that end after 2008 and the GFC. And I tried to just riff off of him and call it hypo-globalization because it's not truly deglobalization yet. Maybe that's the direction we're headed, but that was the trend prior to the world wars. We could just be in a stagnation sort of phase with regard to globalization, and it would be underperforming, so hypo-globalization, but it wouldn't necessarily be collapsing. I think we have to have a whole series of new and bad things happen to lead us into World War III. It could happen, but maybe not the clearest trajectory yet. So to then answer your question from there, I would say, look, if a country tries to deal with restless social forces by blaming others and adopting an aggressive foreign policy, that is a very time-tried tactic. And not just a tactic. Sometimes it's like a distraction, like when Reagan invades Grenada. But other times, it really is a strategy, like when the Christian West coalesces around crusades as a strategy to try to consolidate because of too much social disruption and division at home. So I think we do have to be very worried about that. In Russia's case, it clearly is the case that they were suffering from too unstable of a domestic sphere, and it did lead to outward aggression. I think with China over the past 10 or 15 years, the jury's still out, but I think there is evidence that this dynasty is responding to weaker economic and social stability with greater foreign policy assertiveness and in some cases aggression. And that may not have been the case for every dynasty, but it may be the case in this situation. So I think we have to really monitor that one. That's probably the most important one. And then finally, the United States. If Trump and the Republicans win, I'm actually of the view that they will channel U.S. divisions and polarization and social discontent outward, and it will be an aggressive regime. I get pushback for that because people say, well, Trump is really all about trade, and he wants to pull out of wars. He criticized endless wars. He criticized the Bush family. I totally see all that. But when I look at what Trump and Republicans' policies actually mean, it means we're going to enforce the oil sanctions on Iran and make an ultimatum that they don't get a nuclear weapon. I think that's going to cause an escalation of conflict in the region that would be likely to draw in U.S. forces. And I think that even though they may be willing to abandon Ukraine, they won't be able to or willing to abandon Taiwan. And so, Trump can be accused of being isolationist in certain areas, and maybe it'll end up that way. But my best guess is that the U.S. is still very capable of intervening abroad, and opinion can change pretty quickly, so that the discontent socially in the U.S. very well could be channeled outward in the coming years.
So we have time for one more little piece of this, and of course what you just said is wonderfully counter consensus, and probably we should have a whole different discussion on that down the road. But we're recording this right on the heels of the NATO summit, the big 75th anniversary of NATO and things like that. And the Euro-Atlantic system, the American North Atlantic European system, was a dominant shaper of the post-World War II, of the entire Cold War, and for much of the post-Cold War period has basically asserted that it is the inevitable future of the world. And of course, we're seeing that pushback from other countries that have asserted that they exist too, and they have their own history and their own philosophy and their own economic ideals and things of that sort. But the construct, although it's been stressed multiple times, the construct of North American and Western European cooperation and coordination has been a pretty important factor in understanding the shape and direction of the global system for quite a while now. Given what you're seeing in the different elections, in this pushback against consensus, in the potential direction of change in the United States, in some of these European countries, do you see this year of elections, and not just saying, only from this year of elections, but being reflected in this year of elections, being a potential break in a more significant way, at least for a period of time, in transatlantic unity? Or are those connections things that overcome even these political disruptions?
Yeah, great. It's a great one. And I do think that the question itself underscores the most important foreign policy question of the Trump administration. Because what I've seen is, the like we already talked about this and touched on it, the Democrats and Republicans at this point are very much aligned on China, so I don't see this election being impactful there. I think they differ on Iran. Democratic Party has been very focused on engaging with Iran, and the new pragmatic president in Iran would engage with Biden. So I think there'd be at least a delaying action of diplomacy to suspend a massive conflict over the nuclear program in Iran if the Democrats won. And that's different than if Republicans win. And with Ukraine, there's the issue that I think Republicans would reduce support, and it would ultimately it would put pressure on Ukraine to come to an earlier ceasefire. And that's different than the Democrats. And I think the one takeaway from the NATO summit was they still are fixated on bringing Ukraine into NATO, and Democrats have really adopted that as a staunch policy and an extension of their longer lasting internationalist approach. And so in that case, you would really have an escalation or a new brinksmanship with Russia if the Democrats win the election. So those are all, some elements of this, but your question is much deeper, and it goes to those social forces. And I've sort of looked at it because you can definitely see, if the Republicans win, you can see a major quarrel between the U.S. and Europe. I mean, really major, because the break with Russia has substantially changed the economic system in Europe. They won't get as much cheap energy. And if they are then forced by the United States to divorce from the Chinese economy preemptively, before China engages in a major act of belligerence, if they have to divorce from that economy, then in a way, the U.S. is depriving them of their ability to grow their exports, and therefore putting a major cap on their economic growth. Then they have higher energy costs and lower export revenues, and the Americans are sort of maybe charging into that conflict prematurely with China. Of course, the American view of it is, well, we don't need to appease. But the European view is, well, the jury's still out. We don't really know that China's going to behave in a truly belligerent manner. So I think that could cause a problem. If Trump imposes tariffs on allies as well as rivals, if he threatens to walk away from NATO, and I mean specifically issues notice that the United States is withdrawing from NATO, then Europeans will consolidate around the Macron position, and I do think they're doing that, which is sort of, well, we need to have strategic autonomy. And this will make the whole quarrel between Jacques Chirac and George W. Bush look like a joke, a walk in the park, because this would be really the emergence of a potential for strategic breakage between a unified geopolitical Europe, a geopolitical entity of Europe, a continental European empire, breaking with the North American empire. And even if that didn't end up happening, we would have to glimpse it, and we would have to react to that and respond to that. So I think it's hugely important what happens on that front in particular. When I really look at the analysis, I still come back to the fact that Trump is just one man. A presidential office is just 4 years. Charles de Gaulle temporarily took France out of NATO's military command, and then later France rejoined. The truth is that Europe draws its nuclear protection from the United States. It now imports a lot more natural gas from the United States, and the United States Navy ensures that Europe continues to get liquefied natural gas from everywhere else, from Qatar and from Australia. And so for Europe to try to pursue strategic autonomy rapidly simply because Trump imposes tariffs, I don't think that's how it will work. So my best guess is that we will have a huge quarrel and disagreement, but that the U.S. and Europe are still married to each other because they both do face combined threats from autocratic powers, namely Russia and China, and they both have a shared incentive of patrolling the Persian Gulf and making sure there's some semblance of stability in the Middle East. And so that can sound a little bit rosy, but I know a lot of my European friends will say, well, you're whitewashing some of the risks here, but I don't think I am. I think it will be very ugly and bad in the quarrel, but I don't know that we yet have a basis for Europe and the U.S. to divorce and Europe to become a truly independent geopolitical pole.
Which brings us way back to our starting point, which was it all depends upon what time frame you're looking at.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I think speaking of time frames, that's about the time that we have now. But I really want to thank you, Matt, for coming on and having this conversation.
Well, thank you, Rodger. It's a pleasure to be with you and to speak to your audience, and also just to get a chance to hang out again.
We've been talking with Matt Gertken, the Chief Geopolitical and U.S. Political Strategist at BCA Research. For more risk insights and analysis, visit ranenetwork.com, where you can learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions. That's RANE network.com. I'm Rodger Baker. Thanks for listening.